Hello everyone, Nick here, and in my last video, which is my Philadelphia Flower Show plant haul, I discussed how I thought this Fatsia japonica, while beautiful, would be considered a rather underrated houseplant that most people would probably graze over if they were shopping in a plant store. So I thought it'd be kind of a fun idea to put together a list of what I thought to be my top 5 underrated houseplants. So while making this list, which is in no particular order, there were a few things to consider. So as someone who runs a social media account based around plants, I was considering, if I post a plant and I noticed that it may not get as many likes as another plant that I post, or most other plants that I post, or also as somebody who works in a plant shop and is a buyer for a plant shop, considering those plants that I think are gonna sell, but then really just stick around in the shop for quite a while and people just totally graze over them, like the Fatsia japonica I mentioned at the beginning of this video. The first houseplant I consider to be extremely underrated would be this Schefflera actinophylla Amate. This plant is extremely beautiful, just like every other plant that's going to be on this list. And it really just stood out to me because not only are the leaves just extremely glossy and beautiful, but the older leaves have these stems that are just beautifully purple, as well as the main stem before it goes woody. You can kind of see it behind the leaves, but it's just got this beautiful purple tint and it just really stands out through the leaves, and I just really enjoy this plant. In fact, I enjoy this plant so much that after I had purchased this one in a 6-inch pot, I went ahead and I actually purchased this one. It's a bigger one right here, which is actually in an 8-inch pot, which is a much bigger upgrade than I would have expected in an 8-inch pot, but really just such a cool plant. This plant really does require a lot of light. If you're familiar with Schefflera arboricola, the more common Schefflera or umbrella plant, you may have had it rot like I have many times that I've tried to take care of it because I just don't give it enough light and I give it too much water. So I'm very careful with this plant. I have it right in front of a south-facing window on the floor, so it's not getting harsh sunlight all day, but it's just getting some really bright light. And then I keep the 6-inch one on my nightstand in my bedroom, which is also about 5 feet back from a south-facing window, so that gets some really bright light throughout the day. So these guys have already been growing wonderfully for me. I've been seeing a lot of new growth, but I am just so psyched to see how large this thing is gonna get over time because it's already pretty big, and I'm really a fan of the Schefflera Amate, and I think it's just a shame that when I have them in the store, they kind of stick around for quite a bit, and I really have to point them out to people before they notice the wonderful qualities about this plant. One thing about this plant that I didn't even really notice for a while is that it's used like everywhere in like lobbies, malls. I just see it all over the place in Philadelphia since I have gotten mine. Like I just didn't even know about this plant until I first saw it, and I just feel like it was, as Maria from Bloom and Grow Radio refers to it, as plant blindness, where you just like, before you had the plant or before you were into plants, you just didn't even notice that plants were everywhere. And this is a plant that is seriously everywhere that I just like couldn't believe I was missing out on because it is just absolutely beautiful. The second plant I consider to be highly underrated is Cissus. This one right here is Sissis Rumbafolia, and it's commonly known as grape leaf ivy. And as the name entails, it looks a lot like your standard English ivy. However, it is not, and it is a lot easier to grow. While some people can successfully grow English ivy, I cannot, and I consider it to be an extremely hard houseplant to grow for 2 reasons specifically. One, that it requires very bright light to grow properly, and 2, it gets spider mites very easily. In fact, I don't even like to sell it in the store that I work at because when I get them in stock, half the time they have spider mites, so I just don't even order them anymore. However, Cissus are much more wonderful, much more easier going in the home, and this plant just grows like a weed for me, and it almost kind of looks like a weed, but I just really enjoy how this plant grows, and it has these little grape-like trendles or vines that come off that actually are looking for something to grab onto. I have another Cissus I, which I'll include a little shot of right now, that is climbing up the leather hanger of the pot that it's hanging in. It's just so cool how it just knows how to climb up, and it's almost to the top right now, so I don't really know what I'm gonna do when it gets to the top of that leather. But there are a few kinds of Cissus that I grow in my house. This one, as I said, is Sissis Rumbafolia, that's called grape leaf ivy. However, there's another one I grow that I only have a small cutting of and a few more cuttings that I'm currently rooting, but this one is called Sissis Rumbafolia oak leaf ivy, where the leaves look a lot more like an oak leaf. And as well as the Cissus I that that I showed you earlier that was climbing up the leather. I have this little cutting of a much larger Cissus variety that I actually do not even know the variety of it. It was just sold to me as a giant grape leaf ivy, but this was more of a funky branch that was coming off of one of the plants I had in stock at Urban Jungle, the plant store I work at. So I chopped it off to make the plant look a little bit better, and I brought the cutting home, and it has rooted quite well, and it actually just shot off this little branch right here. So I'm super excited to see what this little branch turns into one day, because the leaves are huge and the plant in store that I chopped this off of was just a monster. So Cissus are just really, really awesome plants that people just graze over in the store. When I had them in stock, I think one plant actually stuck around for like 3 or 4 months because people just like grazed right over it, and they were just so beautiful, and they sat under the grow lights that under atop of the plant hangers in my shop for so long that they just like grew all the way up the plant hangers and were just absolute beasts by the time they finally sold. So a really, really underrated plant that I really wish would be a little bit more known because it's just really beautiful. The third plant for my top 5 underrated houseplants would have to be Aspidistras. This one right here is an Aspidistra eladia variegata. However, I would consider all Aspidistras to be extremely underrated. Aspidistras are commonly known as cast iron plants, and they were a plant that was very popular back in the houseplant craze in like the 70s and the 80s. However, this plant has kind of fallen out of popularity since then, but it is a shame because this plant is so incredible, because this plant really thrives on neglect. This is a plant that I really just throw in my shower maybe once every month, maybe every 6 weeks, and that is how I care for it. That is the only thing I do. Every now and again I need to do a little bit more of upkeep, because when I purchased this plant it came with a little bit of scale, so I see a little bit of the scale on the leaves right now that I should be cleaning off. But otherwise, this plant has been very, very easygoing for me. Not only does it not require very much water, but it doesn't require very much sunlight. However, since this one specifically is variegated and does have some white in the leaves, I do give it a little bit more light than I would give one that had no variegation, which you'll more commonly see them as just plain green leaves. The only bad thing about this plant is how expensive it is. Because it is such a slow grower and more commonly sold in larger planters, this one is a 10-inch pot, it is more commonly pretty expensive. And you can't normally find it at somewhere like a big box store that normally sells cheap plants, because they just can't really sell it cheap because it costs so much to buy. So I know for me in store, if I ever buy this plant, I usually don't buy it unless somebody pre-orders it, because it costs so much, and I really just don't want it sitting around in the store forever, because I don't know if someone's going to want to spend the amount of money this plant can normally cost. But if you do find this plant for a steal, like I actually found this plant at a farmer's market for $15, which is ridiculous cheap because they cost me a lot more than $15 to order wholesale. So I could not buy this plant, but otherwise a really, really easy plant and really great if it just wasn't so expensive. Number 4 is going to be Pothos. So I was kind of wrestling with the idea of whether or not I wanted Pothos on this list of underrated houseplants because they're everywhere, but that is exactly why these are on this list. I think these plants can be a little bit grazed over, and people tell me at the shop when I show them this plant, they're like, that's a little too common for me, I don't really want that, even though it's like the perfect plant for their space. Even me, it took me over a year when I first started collecting houseplants to get my first Pothos, because I would just see them everywhere and I was just like, I don't really want it. But it took until I got my first Pothos before I realized that they just turn your home into a jungle, and it is like the plant to turn your home into a jungle. It is #Jungalo style. That is what this plant is, and I regret not getting one as my first houseplant because 1, they're incredibly easy. In fact, I really just like to let my Pothos go until, specifically my golden Pothos, I let them wilt before I water them. My other ones, like my Cebu Blues, I like to beat them a little bit to their wilt because they're not as forgiving. But the golden Pothos right here is like the easiest houseplant in existence, and it's just a shame that it's so common. You just kind of like forget about it sometimes. But this is one I've had for not very long at all. I've just had this one hanging out on the back of my shelf. In fact, I haven't pulled it out ever. I didn't even realize that it's this long, so I think I'm gonna have to display it somewhere else because this is a real beauty that shouldn't be hiding on one of my shelves. But plants like the Cebu Blue are like a little bit more sought after, I would say, but just like the plain golden Pothos is definitely very, very underrated. There's a bunch more kinds of Pothos, and I like to keep a bunch of them in my home because they really do achieve that jungle vibe like I was saying. This one right here is the Neon Pothos, and this is actually the first Pothos that I ever purchased, and the only reason I purchased it was because it was on sale for like $1 and already trailing half of this length. It took until I realized what this plant did to my home aesthetic before I started getting a bunch of them, and now I probably have, oh, just looking around the room in this living room, there's at least 10 pothos just growing around because, I mean, the proof is right here. You have it. Number 4, pothos. And the last plant I want to talk about today, or my number 5 underrated houseplant, is going to be this Natal Mahogany. So this is a plant that I think is very much not known. I rarely see this plant on Instagram. I just started seeing this plant pop up on my availability lists, and it's just like amazing. This plant just is like northwestern forest feeling. It just has such a wonderful vibe. It's like dream forest vibes, and they're huge. Like, they come really big. This one is in a 10-inch pot, and it's probably about 5 feet tall, including the planter. Actually, no, I'd say it's probably as tall as me, so it's at least like 5.5 feet tall with the planter. So really wonderful plant, and just really easy plant. The thing about these plants that's really wonderful, and why it's a shame that they're not more in cultivation, is that these plants really don't need a lot of light, and they like a lot of water. So thinking about like the ficus lyrata or the fiddle leaf fig, when we read about that on the internet, we commonly hear like, oh, the plant, everybody wants it, but it's so hard to take care of. It's constantly dropping leaves and this and that, it's yellowing. What happens mostly, or what is going on most of the time, is when we bring home that fiddle leaf fig, we are giving it not enough light and too much water, which is why the Natal Mahogany is just so incredible, and why I've just been so adamant on keeping them in stock in the store that I work at, and showing them to people who are new at plants, because not only is this plant absolutely lush, but it is just insanely easy. I water mine once a week with the watering can. I usually give it about half of a watering can, and then once every 2 weeks I throw it in the shower. So I just give it a really good clean. I get the leaves, all the dust off the leaves, and then I give the plant a really good soak. I usually just throw it in a lukewarm shower at not a hard pressure, but you know, like my shower water pressure already sucks, so it's not a big deal if I just throw it in there for 5 minutes. But I just run it with some lukewarm water and just let it just pour all over the leaves, and then just water the plant. And this is really good for any large plant. I do this with my monsteras. I do it with my Schefflera Amate, the large one. I do it with my peace lily that's back there. I do it with all my big plants because they accumulate so much dust, and I really just, sometimes they have a pot that just drains onto the floor if I water it, so I usually just throw all my big plants in the shower, and I'll actually do this with a lot of my little plants too. But yes, Natal Mahogany, an extremely underrated plant. I wish it was more out there because it's so beautiful, and it's been starting to sell well in the shop, but it's just one that you just don't see it anywhere. Nobody has it, and it's a shame because it is just like the easiest plant, and it would give a lot more people confidence bringing a larger plant into their home if it was a plant as easy and wonderful as the Natal Mahogany. As a little extra entry, I actually turned to you guys and asked what you thought was the most underrated houseplant on my Instagram story, and a lot of you guys said Sansevierias, which I thought was a little shocking because personally, I don't think they're overrated whatsoever, but I think they're right on the mark. I think they're hitting the nail right on the head. I don't have any problem with them selling in the shop. When I post them on Instagram, they usually get a good amount of likes, so yeah, I don't necessarily agree, but I don't disagree. They're not by any means overrated because they are just like one of the easiest plants to care for, and one of the coolest plants too. These are two really fun varieties right here. This is some type of Sansevieria trifasciata, and this is Sansevieria cylindrica bonkel, or a starfish Sansevieria. So really cool plants that are apparently a little underrated. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching my video today on my top 5 underrated houseplants. Just to recap, the list was Schefflera Amate, Cissus, Aspidistra, Pothos, and Natal Mahoganies. Let me know what you think of my list in the comments below, and let me know also what plants you think are very underrated. I also just want to take a moment to shout out 2 up-and-coming YouTubers on the plant scene. One is Betsy Begonia, and 2 is Not Dude. They are absolutely blowing me out of the water. Their videos are incredible, and I am just in awe at the stuff they're doing. They're so entertaining to watch, and I am saying that at the bottom of my heart. I really enjoy watching them. So I highly recommend you guys check them out. If you enjoy watching me, you're going to enjoy watching them 1,000 times more. So I'm going to include links to their channels in my description, and I hope you guys check them out. Otherwise, if you aren't already, follow me on Instagram at phillyfoliage, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Have a great day!